bombing enemy positions only minutes after they had been located. The British had begun to excel at two things pre-war planners had largely discounted: air-to-air dogfighting and tactical air support. But as the British fighter squadrons honed their skill in Africa, the war that the planners had in fact planned for was building over Europe. There, the small counterattacks that had begun during the Battle of Britain had grown into a full-fledged counteroffensive. British bombers went south over the English Channel, targeting industries and shipping. The British learned over Germany what the Germans were learning over London. Undefended bombers make easy prey. Following a disastrous raid on the city of Aalborg, Denmark on August 13, 1940, daylight bombing quickly tapered off. British Bomber Command elected instead to bomb under cover of darkness. Bombing at night made the British flights harder to find. Of course, it also made it harder for the bomber crews to find their targets. Still, morale among the bomber crews soared. They returned alive and reported tremendous results. But there were no objective signs that the campaign was affecting Germany's ability to wage war.
If tonight the people of London were asked to cast their vote as to whether a convention should be entered into to stop the bombing of all cities, an overwhelming majority would cry, "No, we will mete out to the Germans the measure, and more than the measure, they have meted out to us."
That lack of tangible result frustrated Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Initially opposed to the whole idea of strategic bombing, Churchill realized that the only way for the English to retaliate for German bombing was to bomb Germans. Enraged by the relentless death and destruction wrought by the Luftwaffe, his moral reservations vanished. He wanted German cities hit, and he wanted them hit hard. Much to his consternation, Bomber Command instead directed its efforts against German oil refineries and rail yards. Churchill ordered a thorough analysis of the damage bombing had done to the German war industry. The resulting document, called the Butt Report, sent a tremor of unease through the RAF. Accuracy, the report concluded, was non-existent. Damage was minimal. The standard of success at Bomber Command had degenerated to the point where a bomb falling within 5 miles of his target was scored a hit. The Butt Report proved that Allied air doctrine was centered around a fantasy: precision bombing. One of the first to surrender this fantasy was Air Marshal Arthur Harris, recently appointed Chief of Bomber Command. Harris, like Churchill, believed that the way to defeat Germany was to bomb its cities, to do to the Germans what the Germans had tried to do to the British. In order to accomplish this, he abandoned the dream of pinpoint bombing in industrially dense areas. Harris reasoned that if the RAF couldn't hit a target the size of a single factory, it could at least hit a target the size of a city. Harris called this technique area bombing. The Air Marshal plainly despised the Germans, and moderation was not part of his plan. In the first of many such missions, on May 20th, 1942, he sent more than 1,000 bombers to strike Cologne. The planes dropped nearly 30 million pounds of explosives and destroyed 8 square miles of the ancient city. Harris announced proudly that the RAF had at long last hit on a winning formula. Weeks later, units of the U.S. 8th Air Force arrived in Britain. Much to the chagrin of the British, American commanders pushed for the return of daylight bombing. They had been waiting for years to prove the invincibility and destructive power of massed heavy bombers, and weren't going to let the failure of the British deter them from their holy grail. Churchill and Harris, on the other hand, wanted the 8th attached to the RAF's night bombing campaign. At the Casablanca Conference, the 8th's commander, General Ira Eaker, persuaded Churchill and Roosevelt to bomb Germany both day and night. By May 1943, the combined bomber offensive was a go. Operation Point Blank was born. From early in the war, the Allies knew that an invasion of Europe would be necessary. Point Blank was the softening up process. To augment the British bombers, the Americans brought B-17s. These flying fortresses had been designed to be self-defending, with machine guns pointed in every direction. They also contained the legendary Norden bomb sight, a powerful analog computer purported to be able to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The point-blank order of battle called for winning air superiority, not by knocking individual German fighters out of the sky, but by destroying the Nazi aviation industry as a whole. Heading the target list were German fighter bases, ball bearing factories, and oil refineries. Once those were gone, the Allies would enjoy the same freedom to operate over Europe that they'd enjoyed in North Africa. It seemed on paper as if Point Blank was the mission for which the Allied air forces had been created. Strategic bombing would at long last have a chance to, in effect, win a war. The ensuing months, however, brought less than stellar results. Despite the incredible bravery shown by the crews of American and British bombers, damage to German facilities was minimal. In contrast, Allied losses were massive. Bomber crews of the 8th suffered mightily for their leaders' absolute belief in daylight bombing. Missions invariably resulted in many deaths and little tangible effect on the ground. The problem lay with the lack of fighter escorts for the bombers. Except on shorter runs, there were no fighters in England with sufficient range to shield the bombers all the way to and from their targets. The Luftwaffe knew this and refused to attack the aerial armadas until their escorts had turned back for England. The B-17s in battle were not nearly as self-defending as advertised. In order to avoid their guns, the German pilots began attacking the fortresses head-on. It was a brutal and highly effective technique, and once proven, spread quickly through the German Air Force. The Luftwaffe pilots also grew adept at disrupting the carefully assembled formations of bombers, picking stragglers off one at a time. The job of the B-17s was made even more dangerous by the tool that had promised to make them more deadly, the Norden bomb sight. The Norden was a top-secret national treasure. Unfortunately, in order to use it properly, a plane needed a 20-mile run into its target. During this time, the bomber flew essentially on autopilot, unable to take evasive action. German anti-aircraft guns concentrated around likely targets were able to blast the planes out of the sky like ducks in a shooting gallery. The toll grew intolerable even to those who evangelized the power of strategic bombing. In 2 raids against Regensburg and Schweinfurt, more than 100 Allied bombers were shot down. The ball bearing and plane factories in the towns, while damaged, were hardly put out of business. Following these disastrous missions, Hap Arnold halted daylight bombing, pending the arrival of a fighter capable of escorting the bombers all along their routes. The longest-range fighter in the American arsenal, the Lockheed P-38, might have done the job. Before the war, the Americans had had great hopes for the Lightning, but the British were not fond of the unusual plane. Obsessed with intercepting incoming German aircraft, the RAF cared only about a plane's rate of climb and flight ceiling. The P-38 climbed slowly and topped out too low for British tastes. Most of the Lightnings ended up in the Pacific, where long range was the most important factor. Ironically, the P-38's performance was not as sluggish as the British had thought. Before the American entry into the war, the security-conscious U.S. refused to ship its secret turbine-powered supercharger technology to Europe. The turbocharger was designed to feed compressed air into the carburetor for increased performance in the rarefied atmosphere of high altitudes. The British had tested and rejected a plane with vastly different flight characteristics than the one they would have received. By the time the real Lightnings began arriving in 1943, however, the first P-51 Mustang squadrons were only a month from deployment. The P-51 was the most modern fighter in the Allied arsenal. It was fast, well-armed, and with its droppable wing tanks, could fly from airfields in Britain all the way to Berlin and back. With the arrival of the Mustang, the Allied push for air superiority over Europe resumed. The Germans continued their previously successful tactics, but found themselves face to face with a brand new foe. The war, they knew, had changed. Hermann Goering said that upon seeing the Mustangs over Berlin, he knew that the war was lost. The bombers, he realized, could no longer be stopped. The approaching invasion of Europe was the greatest military undertaking in history. As the Allies prepared, they realized that mere air superiority wouldn't ensure victory. They needed to eliminate all challenge in the air, to move unfettered over the battlefield. Air supremacy, rather than superiority, became the mission of point blank. There were two competing plans for the air campaign against Germany. In what was called the Transportation Plan, pilots flying low over northern France severely disabled Nazi rail lines and communications. This compelled German reinforcements to move in narrow columns, extremely vulnerable to ground attack aircraft. The shift in emphasis angered the bomber partisans, who felt that by taking pressure off the Luftwaffe, they might be surrendering air superiority. Their proposed alternative was called the Oil Plan. By striking at heavily defended synthetic oil plants, the Allied forces could entice the German fighters into the sky. There, the Allied fighters could duel and presumably defeat their Nazi counterparts, while the bombers attacked targets on the ground. General Eisenhower offered a compromise. On most days, transportation plan targets would be struck. But when weather precluded attacking close to the front, oil plan targets would gain top priority. The compromise implied an extensive target list for the 8th Air Force. In the weeks before the invasion, the 8th seemed to be everywhere, bombing and strafing oil plants, rail yards, airfields, factories, and missile sites. By D-Day, the Luftwaffe had been overwhelmed. It had no operable airfields in Normandy. The Allied oil plan was doubly damaging. Not only did American escorts down dozens of enemy fighters, but the loss of precious refining capacity cut deeply into Luftwaffe operations. Fuel that had been intended for German flight operations had to be diverted to land forces. By the time of the Normandy invasion, the Luftwaffe had run almost dry. As Allied forces pushed off the beaches of northern France, the effectiveness of their air strategy became apparent. They had reached a balance of strategic and tactical air power. Strikes against strategic oil reserves and manufacturing facilities denied German forces desperately needed supplies. Tactical air support by heavily armored fighters such as the P-47 Thunderbolt limited German mobility and made counterattack nearly impossible. But the central reason for the success of air support following the invasion was coordination. Like the cab ranks in North Africa, planes loitering above the battlefield could be summoned to the ground when help was needed. To facilitate coordination even further, the Air Corps placed observers at the front of Allied columns. These men could radio precise enemy locations to the pilots. The effect was devastating. In 6 years of war, the Allies had gone from a vision of air power centered on a single activity, strategic bombing, to a reality dependent upon a high degree of flexibility. Germany's technological advances, including the first combat jet, could not overcome the Allied ability to put the right force in the right place at the right time. All the same, the early vision of air power as a war winner remained unfulfilled. Air power had paved the way, but the war in Europe did not end until Allied troops marched into Berlin. World War II continued in the Pacific, where the air war had developed along divergent lines. There, the great distances precluded an Allied strategic bombing campaign against Japan. Until the Allies could push within range of the home islands, Japanese industry was fairly secure. So, from the start, air power in the Pacific served the tactical needs of the forces on the ground and at sea. The Air Force and Navy flyers had two jobs: protect the sea lanes and support ground troops. Early in the war, Army and Navy strategy came to revolve around air power. Planes became increasingly important, providing pre-invasion bombardments, close air support, reconnaissance, and transport. In deciding which islands to take, the critical question was, does it have or can it support airstrips? If it didn't, no matter how strongly reinforced, it could be safely bypassed. If it had an airbase, if the enemy could use it to harass naval and amphibious operations, it had to be taken. Thus the Navy set out on a novel new strategy: island hopping. Through the simultaneous application of sea, land, and air power, the U.S. was able to leapfrog heavily defended islands in favor of lightly defended ones nearby. Navy engineers grew adept at installing airfields in only days, often before enemy resistance had been eliminated. With a new platform from which to operate, the various forces could then disrupt enemy shipping to the bypassed islands, while simultaneously looking forward to their next target. The U.S. Navy hopscotched across thousands of miles of ocean, moving inexorably closer to Japan. Once the Mariana Islands had been secured, the Japanese mainland was within range of America's newest plane, the Boeing B-29. The superfortress was the furthest extension of the strategic bomber concept and the greatest aeronautical spectacle of its time. It had a wingspan of 141 feet and a range of more than 4,000 miles. Its mechanical and electronic systems were the most advanced in the world. The pressurized cabin allowed its crew of 12 to fly at an altitude of nearly 6 miles without being affected by the extreme cold and lack of oxygen. For defense, it had 12 remote-controlled machine guns and 1 cannon. At $3 billion, development of the B-29 was the first truly massive U.S. military expenditure, exceeding in cost even the development of the atomic bomb. Its superiority as a strategic bomber set a standard that the American military-industrial complex would aspire to maintain throughout the next 50 years. Hap Arnold had pushed mightily for the superfortress, but Admiral Ernest King managed to block expenditures. He claimed that speeding the B-29's development would hamper progress in the Pacific War. Nonetheless, it jumped from the drawing board to deployment in just 3 years, a remarkable feat for any plane, a miracle for a plane of its unrivaled complexity. In January 1944, Arnold visited Boeing's B-29 plant in Wichita, Kansas. There he found that almost no one knew how to fly the new planes. Only 67 air crews were ready, and the system's complexity had slowed training to a crawl. Arnold needed a pilot to master the plane, work out its lingering bugs, and find a way to train crews as quickly as the planes were coming off the assembly line. Arnold asked General Jimmy Doolittle, then in command of the Strategic Air Command in Europe, to select the best bomber pilot in the Mediterranean. Doolittle recommended Colonel Paul Tibbets, who went immediately to work developing a new training regimen for B-29 crews. Finally, Arnold was in a position to fulfill the pre-war promise of strategic bombing. He had the most advanced plane in the world, and he was within range of an enemy who had refused to break despite 4 years of losses. Arnold established the 20th Army Air Force and gave it sole control of the entire American inventory of superforts. Its purpose was to bomb the Japanese into submission. General Haywood S. Hansel, Jr. commanded the B-29s and followed the doctrine of high-altitude daylight bombing with high explosives. In 6 months of operations, the 20th garnered unpromising results. Arnold grew increasingly irritated. He believed that the best means of destroying Japan's cities was to set them ablaze. He repeatedly urged Hansel to use incendiary bombs. Hansel dragged his feet and was replaced by Curtis LeMay. LeMay was a strict disciplinarian, a devout believer in the power of the bomber, and a brilliant innovator. In Europe, he and General Frederick L. Anderson had developed the combat box formation, a flight configuration which permitted the maximum number of B-17 guns to be brought to bear on the enemy. He had also pioneered pattern bombing. In contrast to precision bombing, a formation of bombers, on cue from its lead bombardier, released their loads in unison. The result was devastation spread across a broad area. While most bombs would miss the designated target, some would presumably, almost by chance, hit it. Pattern bombing had proved essential to the effective use of incendiary bombs. American scientists had determined that the best way to burn a city was to start hundreds of small blazes that would grow, merge, and create a firestorm. That was exactly what LeMay wanted, and he wanted it without respite for the Japanese. He trained his men to use radar so they could bomb at night and in inclement weather. For several weeks, he had his crews fly training missions against smaller targets in Asia. 2 preliminary incendiary raids against Singapore and Tokyo went well. On March 9th, LeMay launched the largest B-29 mission yet, a kind of coming-out party for incendiary bombing in Japan. The target, Tokyo. LeMay ordered 334 superforts stripped of guns, ammunition, armor plating, and unnecessary crewmen so they could carry more bombs. by the time the first wave of bombers had finished its run, the firestorm had already begun. The flames were visible to subsequent waves from 50 miles away. For 3 years, every adult in Tokyo had been trained in firefighting. Their efforts were futile in the face of the firestorm. Temperatures rose to over 1,000 degrees. Windows melted. Water in the city's canals boiled. Above the city, B-29s were buffeted hundreds of feet upward by the thermal column. Smoke and the smell of burning flesh filled the planes as bomb bay doors swung open. By morning, more than 16 square miles of Tokyo were ash. 85,000 people had been killed and 1 million left homeless. In the following months, LeMay's bombers struck Japan again and again. The Japanese will remained unbroken. The promise of strategic bombing was unfulfilled. That changed, however, with the arrival of the first atomic bomb. By the summer of 1945, every major city on the mainland had been set to the torch, with 4 exceptions: Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki, and Nagata. These cities had been preserved so that damage done by the bomb would be more dramatic. The bomb was to be delivered by the 509th Composite Group under the command of Paul Tibbets. The scientists who had built it nicknamed it Little Boy. Here was the fulfillment of Trenchard's dream, of Baldwin's specter. The lone bomber deep in enemy territory, laying waste to the land below. Allied bomber doctrine had grown to include many missions, but it had always been building toward this.